I was going to ask you about poppies, but I think you answered it. I assume if we're not going to eradicate poppy fields, at some point we're going to show them or help them plant something else that makes money.
Well, it's a little odd for you and me, New Yorkers, to sit here at the 92nd Street Y and talk about pomegranates, pistachios, almonds, wheat, but I'm learning.
There you go.
It's kind of amazing, but in the last 8 years, the United States spent more money spraying poppy crops than it did building up agriculture. Now, Afghanistan was an agricultural country. And until the Soviet invasion in 1978, it exported all the products I just mentioned and more. Good German Riesling wines from the Shumali Plain north of Kabul to the world. They were the breadbasket of Central Asia. They may be illiterate, they may be poor, but they're really good farmers to get food out of that rocky, high-altitude soil. And then the whole thing collapsed. And the previous administration went out and sprayed the poppy crops, thereby making the farmer growing the only cash crop left to them with the roads destroyed and the irrigation destroyed and marketplaces decimated, alienating these people. We stopped that early this year. It was controversial. The British and the Russians both thought we were making a mistake. The UN drug people thought it was the right decision. The idea had come to me on a trip that Kati and I had made to Afghanistan 4 years ago when the people running the program kept telling us it isn't going to work. And I kept saying, well, if it's not going to work, why are we spending hundreds of millions of dollars on it? Well, you know, famously President Bush had said he was a crop duster man. He said this to the ambassador and to the government, and he personally liked this program. We ended it. Okay, now that doesn't mean, Jim, that we gave up on the drugs. Right. Drugs are a huge problem. $4 billion probably in a country where the official GDP is probably 6, 7, 8 billion. And it's an iron nexus of corruption between Taliban, drug lord, warlords, and the police. And we have to break that. So General McChrystal, General Petraeus, myself, Ambassador Eikenberry in Kabul, all got together and we put heavy emphasis on interdiction. Some of you may have seen this summer these big CNN pieces about capturing drug paraphernalia, dried poppies in warehouses, precursor chemicals, blowing them up in the desert. We know from information we've received through the various channels through which we collect information that the Taliban are upset by this. They've lost a recruiting tool, and they're losing and going after one drug bazaar is worth a year of eradication. As you well know, because you ran some terrific articles on this, we were destroying hectares of poppy crops, and the poppy production was going up. But now we have reversed that. Now, on the agriculture side, when I took this job, we had 11 agricultural people in the country, 11. We're now building to 100 plus 5 military National Guard teams from Texas, Nebraska, and 3 other states. And we are pushing very hard on the crops I've just mentioned. And so after our security issue, our number one problem is to train the police and the Army. That's the number one issue. This is the number 2. And it's a unanimous position. Those of you who watched President Obama's speech at West Point may have noted that although there wasn't much comment on civilian programs in that speech because of the nature of the audience and the circumstances, he did mention agriculture. As you know, when I was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, I led the effort to enlarge NATO eastward, including Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. The fact that I was married to Kati had nothing to do with my advocacy of Hungary, but she'd have thrown me out if I hadn't.
Looks as if the Obama administration has made a calculated decision, not against Ukraine and Georgia someday being a member of NATO, but that is not an issue to be pushed at this time. Is that an accurate assessment?
I'm not working on that issue right now.
I know you're
All
not,
I can say is that I'm working very closly with the Georgians because of what I just mentioned. And, but the issue, and there is this Bucharest Declaration left over from last year that says that Georgia and Ukraine will ultimately get NATO membership.
Right.
But you're quite right, there is no timetable. And it's part of a larger terrain in which a lot of other issues have come on the board. In any case, remember, everyone in the room has to remember what NATO means. NATO says in Article 5, an attack on one country is an attack on all of us. Given what's happening in Ukraine, and that's not the subject of tonight's discussion, but you've already mentioned what a chaotic situation it is, I think you have to think twice about extending our security guarantees ratified by 2/3 of the Senate to Ukraine. Georgia's a more complicated question. I have a great deal of personal connections and emotion in the Georgian issue, and very strong views about what happened in August of 2008 there. I went there right after the war, drove up through the burning fields and saw the Russian tanks burning up the fields and all sorts of extraordinary and really ugly sights. But I want to say this about it, that what the Russians did was wrong, and they now occupy 20% of the country. The United States has to deal with this reality as we support Georgia. It's an immensely complicated issue. But I'm glad you've raised it, because we cannot get in a position, which happened during the Vietnam War and happened during Iraq, where every aspect of American foreign policy is subordinated to one issue, and the issue in this case that I'm working on. That's my job, but looking at it writ whole, there are many other issues, including climate change, which has been the subject of this week's attention, the economy, and all sorts of other issues.
Well, with two people as experienced as informed as both of you, we could go right around the world to talk about foreign policy. I thought we ought to dip into a few things, and maybe we can have another session and get to the other ones. But before we close tonight, I want to go back to Afghanistan in particular. And this is a question I think both of you should address. It has to do with education. And the question has to do with, are there plans to improve the access to education for Afghans, since it seems essential to training Afghan forces? And let me just add a footnote. One very big concern in a good part of America is our progress in educating Afghan women and children and girls going to be suborned again if we are unsuccessful in stopping the Taliban from retaking the governance of the country.
Yeah.
Kari, you want to start?
Well, this is a terrifying prospect for me. I think that the Taliban are very well aware of the power of education to shape the future, and that hence the investment into madrasas, which until now they've had a great deal of support from the Saudis. I'm not sure if they're still, Richard, if they're still getting support from the Saudis in building madrasas, but just as if you'll permit a personal sidebar, I am so convinced that education is at the core of so many of what ails the world, that I'm going to start teaching next semester in Jerusalem, at a program that Bard College and Al-Quds are starting. They're merging, those two institutions are merging their faculties and student bodies, and I'm going to be teaching a course to Palestinian students on great books. And frankly, it'll be an education for me, because I've never spent very much time on the West Bank. And I think that the West Bank is obviously, I don't have to persuade anybody here, of enormous importance to all of us, and absolutely essential that the next generation coming up there have a different worldview than the one that Hamas is inculcating.